Let's name what people accuse you of. You're distant. You're cold. You don't let anyone in. You think you're better than everyone. And maybe you've wondered that about yourself sometimes. Because when the world keeps repeating a label, the psyche starts to test it like a mirror. But Jung would say, not every boundary is a wall. Some boundaries are a door with discernment. You are not antisocial. You are selective. And that selectiveness isn't arrogance. It's a psychological necessity. Jung spoke about psychic energy, the inner life force that fuels thought, emotion, meaning, and growth. He believed that this energy is not infinite. It can be spent wisely, or wasted in environments that scatter the self. That's exactly what shallow or chaotic social contact does to a deep person. It drains your psychic energy without giving any nourishment back. It forces you into a persona that feels artificial. It turns connection into performance, and performance into fatigue. So your psyche learns a quiet rule. Only enter spaces that don't cost you your soul. That's not rejection. That's preservation. You don't crave fewer people because you dislike humanity. You crave fewer people because you can't survive in noise disguised as connection. You are built for depth. So your life must reflect depth. And depth doesn't happen everywhere. It happens where you feel safe enough to be real. Where you don't have to shrink your thoughts into smaller language. Where silence isn't punished. Where you are allowed to be complex without being called too much. This is why your circle becomes small and meaningful. Not because you're closed, but because you're careful. Jung said that individuation requires separating what belongs to you from what belongs to the collective. That includes beliefs, values, relationships, and even emotional atmospheres. If someone constantly pulls you into roles that aren't yours, the fixer, the listener, the strong one, the available one, your psyche starts to pull back, not to punish them, but to protect you. Because the deeper you become, the more costly false closeness feels. So you start noticing something that others don't. Some people want your presence, but not your truth. They want your energy, but not your boundaries. They want your light, but they don't respect what it costs you to carry it. That's when selectiveness becomes survival. You don't cut people off impulsively. You simply stop handing your inner world to hands that don't know how to hold it. And yes, that can look cold from the outside. But from the inside, it feels like integrity. Here's the truth you've been trying to explain without words. You don't isolate because you fear connection. You isolate because you honor it. Because for you, connection is sacred. It isn't casual. It isn't automatic. It is something that either nourishes the self or fractures it, and you've already lived long enough to know the difference. But there's another layer here, a shadow layer the world almost never sees. Sometimes selectiveness isn't only wisdom. Sometimes it's a wound, a quiet wound, a place where the heart learned to close because it had to. That's what we need to face next. Not to blame the past, but to understand the real reason so many deep souls become guarded. So if you've been called distant, cold, or hard to reach, let's slow down for a second. Because the real question isn't why you pull away. It's why the world is so afraid of your kind of quiet. And that's where this story begins. There's a quiet kind of person the world often misunderstands. Someone who thinks before they speak, who listens more than they participate, who finds peace where others feel nothing happening. And society, always loud, always urgent, looks at this person and says, "Are you antisocial?" As if silence were a flaw, as if calmness were a crime. But there's a truth nobody talks about. The world isn't built for people who don't fear being alone. It's built for noise, speed, and constant connection, a kind of social performance where presence is confused with value and visibility is mistaken for worth. Yet Jung once wrote that loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. And maybe that's your quiet secret. You're not avoiding people. You're avoiding environments where your depth has no place to breathe. Because the world has created a narrative, a lie, that silence equals coldness and solitude equals brokenness. This is why people look at you and assume distance, disinterest, or emotional walls, when in reality, your silence is not emptiness. It's clarity. It's discernment. It's the ability to sit with your own thoughts without needing someone else to fill the space. But here's the part they never see. You're not silent because you have nothing to say. You're silent because you refuse to waste words on noise. As you listen to this, a question begins to form. If silence isn't a flaw, what is it? Why do some people feel more alive in stillness than in crowds? Why does solitude feel like oxygen to you when others suffocate in it? There's a deeper explanation, one rooted in Jung's understanding of individuation, of inner complexity, of the psychology of the quiet observer. And once you understand it, you'll never let the world define your silence again. We get to that in the next part, but before that, let this sink in. You were never antisocial. You were simply misread by a world terrified of introspection. People often assume that choosing solitude means you're running away. Away from crowds. Away from responsibility. Away from discomfort. But Jung saw something different. To him, solitude wasn't a hiding place. It was a homecoming, a return to the self, the deeper and more authentic layer of identity that gets buried under social expectations and noise. Jung believed that we constantly shift between two psychological forces. The persona, the version of ourselves we present to the world, and the self, the version we discover only in silence. And this is where most misunderstandings begin. Because from the outside, solitude looks like withdrawal. But on the inside, for people like you, solitude is a refinement process. Isolation shrinks you. Refinement expands you, quietly. You've felt this difference. Moments when you stepped away from the world, not because you feared it, but because you were losing clarity inside it. Moments when sitting alone didn't feel lonely. It felt restorative, like your mind finally exhaled after holding the weight of 1,000 inputs. And there's science behind this. A 2023 study published in Nature Communications found that people with higher levels of internal complexity require more frequent periods of low stimulation to maintain cognitive balance. Their brains literally process more per moment, leading to mental saturation faster than others. Another study from the University of Virginia showed that reflective types often choose solitude not to escape emotions, but to regulate them, to integrate experiences rather than simply react to them. In other words, you're not withdrawing from life. You're recalibrating your mind. And Jung knew this when he wrote that individuation, the path toward psychological wholeness, requires periodic detachment from collective influence, so that the self can reorganize and strengthen. Because how can you know who you truly are if you never step away from who the world keeps demanding you be? Your solitude isn't avoidance. It's intelligence. It's emotional hygiene. It's the psychological equivalent of clearing the fog before you try to navigate the road. But as you begin to understand this deeper truth, another realization surfaces, one you've felt your entire life. It's not just that you prefer quiet. It's that your mind becomes overwhelmed faster in environments filled with noise, overstimulation, and emotional chaos. And that's not a defect. It's a sign of a deep processing personality. We'll explore that next, the hidden cost of overstimulation and why people like you feel it more intensely than anyone else. But for now, hold on to this. You're not escaping the world. You're refining your place within it. There's a reason silence feels like oxygen to you. It's not because you're fragile, not because you're too sensitive, and definitely not because you dislike people. It's because your mind processes the world differently. Most people move through life skimming the surface of experience. They pick up what they need, react, and move on. But deep processors don't skim. They absorb. You don't just notice what someone says. You notice what they mean, what they avoid, what their eyes are hiding, what the room feels like when they walk in. You don't just hear noise. You hear patterns inside the noise. And that ability is a gift. But it comes with a cost most people will never understand. The modern world is not designed for deep nervous systems. We live inside constant stimulation. Notifications, fast conversations, background sounds, social pressure, information overload. And research from the last few years has been increasingly clear about this. High-stimulation environments increase cognitive fatigue, emotional dysregulation, and a sense of depersonalization, especially in people with high sensitivity or high introspective traits. Recent work in neuroscience and environmental psychology shows that when the brain is exposed to continuous input without recovery time, it activates stress circuits more intensely, even if the person isn't consciously stressed. That's why you may feel exhausted after a normal social setting while others feel energized. It's not that you're weak. It's that your system is doing more work per second. Some researchers call this deep processing, a tendency to integrate experiences at multiple layers: emotional, symbolic, interpersonal, existential. And deep processing personalities consistently report the same pattern in studies. They become overstimulated faster. They need longer recovery windows. They prefer fewer but more meaningful social connections. And they are more affected by emotional atmosphere than by words alone. So when someone says, "Why are you so quiet?" what they don't realize is that you're already carrying 10 times more internal data than they are. Your silence isn't emptiness. It's mental bandwidth protection. And once you see it through this lens, something changes. You stop believing you're broken. You stop forcing yourself to perform social energy you don't actually have. Because your nervous system is not built for constant access. It's built for depth. But this goes even deeper than overstimulation. Because many deep processors didn't just choose this sensitivity. They developed it in a very specific way. There's a hidden psychological origin to this quiet, watchful nature. One that often begins early in life. And that is where we're going next. Because your solitude isn't random. It has a story. If solitude feels natural to you, it wasn't invented in adulthood. It has a history. Jung believed that personality isn't just something we express. It's something the psyche builds around what it needed to endure, what it needed to protect, and what it needed to make sense of when life was too complex for a child to name. For many deep, quiet people, the original pattern is simple. You became an observer early. Not because you wanted distance, but because observation was safer than exposure. Maybe your early world was emotionally unpredictable. Maybe love was real but inconsistent, warmth was present but conditional, or the people around you carried tensions that were never spoken aloud. In that kind of atmosphere, a child doesn't learn to relax into life. They learn to skin life. So you watched everything, and you learned fast. You learned that a room has a mood before it has a conversation. You learned that silence can be louder than words. You learned that people sometimes say, "I'm fine," while their energy is screaming something else entirely. And without realizing it, you began collecting invisible data because your psyche needed a map to feel safe. That inner child didn't disappear. They matured inside you. Jung would say that when a child adapts like this, they develop a powerful inner orientation. Their attention turns inward, not as a preference, but as a survival strategy. The inner world becomes a shelter. The imagination becomes a refuge. Thought becomes a way of holding the self together when the outer world feels too charged, too confusing, or too demanding. So even now, you don't enter a room casually. You enter it deeply. You notice the tone. You sense the roles. You feel who is performing, who is hiding, who is safe, who is hungry, who is empty. You pick up on what people don't say. You recognize the subtle emotional contracts underneath the conversation. And because of that, social spaces are never just social for you. They are psychological landscapes. That's exhausting, even when you love people. Jung talked about the persona, the mask we wear to meet the world. But not every child is taught that masks are optional. Some children learn to read masks before they can read faces. They grow into adults who can detect the smallest shifts in energy, because their psyche was trained to treat other people's emotional states as important information. So your quiet isn't random. It's patterned. And here's the tender part of it. Solitude is often where that inner child finally rests. Because being alone doesn't feel empty to you. It feels clean. It feels honest. It feels like the only place where you are no longer responsible for tracking everyone else's emotional weather. In solitude, you don't have to interpret. You don't have to adjust. You don't have to shrink your perception or dilute your truth. You get to return to yourself without interference. That's why shallow contact hurts. It's like trying to breathe through fabric. When a person has lived their whole life sensing depth, they can't pretend surface is enough. They can do it for a while, maybe even very gracefully, but it costs them something internally. They leave those spaces not feeling antisocial, but feeling drained of meaning. So you don't avoid people. You avoid environments where your psyche goes numb. You avoid the kind of conversation that forces you to amputate your sensitivity just to belong. Because individuation, the Jungian path of becoming whole, is not polite. It doesn't ask you to fit in. It asks you to be true. And once that inner process begins, your tolerance for false connection collapses. This is the Jungian paradox. Your depth makes you selective, not out of superiority, out of self-respect. And once you understand the origin of your quiet nature, you stop calling it a defect. You see it for what it is, a psyche that learned early to protect the self and later learned how to grow it. Which brings us to what the world still misreads about you. Your selectiveness is not rejection. It is self-preservation, and it is wisdom. Some people don't become selective because they're naturally distant. They become selective because they were taught to be. Not by words, by experience. Jung would call this the moment the psyche develops a social shadow. The shadow isn't evil. It's what you had to hide in order to survive. Sometimes your shadow is anger you never got to express. Sometimes it's grief you weren't allowed to feel. And sometimes it's the quiet part of you that learned to stop trusting. You didn't close your heart overnight. You closed it slowly. One disappointment at a time. One betrayal at a time. One moment of being misunderstood at a time. Because when you're a deep-feeling person, you don't just experience pain. You integrate it. You carry it inside your meaning system. You replay it. You ask what it says about people, about love, about safety, about yourself. And eventually, the psyche creates a rule. If I stay too open, I'll lose myself. That rule becomes a hidden guardian, a silent protector. From the outside, it looks like coldness. But from the inside, it feels like wisdom born from wounds. Maybe you gave too much to people who treated your softness like an unlimited resource. Maybe you were the one who listened, understood, forgave, stayed, while others took and left. Maybe you were punished for having needs, or mocked for being intense, or called too sensitive when you were simply honest. Over time, the persona adapts. You become polite, composed, harder to read, not to deceive anyone, but to keep your inner world safe from people who don't know how to enter it gently. Jung said that what isn't conscious becomes fate. And if your social shadow isn't understood, you might start to believe you're just not built for people. But that's not the truth. The truth is subtler. You are built for people, just not for careless people. The shadow forms where something sacred was mishandled. So your psyche learns to protect the sacred. That's why small talk can feel like hunger. That's why forced closeness can feel like danger. That's why you may vanish quietly instead of explaining yourself. Because explaining yourself to the wrong person feels like bleeding in public. And there's a deeper layer here, too. Sometimes you don't pull away because others are unsafe. Sometimes you pull away because you don't want to meet your own shadow through them. Because relationships are mirrors. And deep people see themselves in mirrors too clearly. If someone triggers your old guilt, your old longing, your old fear of abandonment, your psyche may retreat to avoid reopening unfinished rooms inside you. Not because you're weak, but because you're carrying unfinished inner work. This is the hidden tragedy of good hearts. They don't stop loving. They just stop risking. They don't stop caring. They just stop offering their inner world where it won't be respected. And if that's you, I want you to hear this clearly. Your guardedness is not your identity. It's your history. It's a chapter, not the whole book. Because Jung believed the goal isn't to stay protected forever. The goal is to become whole enough that protection doesn't cost you your life. To learn discernment without numbness. To build boundaries without building prisons. To choose solitude without making it the only home you have. And that brings us to the final truth of this journey. You're not antisocial. You're not broken. You're not too much. You're someone whose psyche has been trying to protect something precious. Now the question becomes, what happens when you stop seeing your quiet as a wound and start seeing it as a path? That's where we go next. Here's what I want you to understand now, after everything we've uncovered. You were never meant to live at the surface. Your psyche doesn't work that way. Some nervous systems are built for stimulation. Others are built for integration. Modern psychology often describes this difference through terms like introversion, high sensitivity, and deep processing. Personalities that don't just experience life, but metabolize it slowly, meaningfully, and at multiple layers. That's why the world can feel loud to you. Not because you hate it, but because you feel it more fully than most people do. Your brain doesn't filter reality the same way. It searches for patterns. It tracks emotional subtext. It connects past and present. It notices what is missing, not just what is happening. So while others are energized by constant interaction, your mind is busy doing something else, making sense of reality. And sense-making takes space. It takes quiet. It takes solitude. It takes that invisible inner room where your psyche can lay everything out on the table and ask, what is this really about? But the story isn't only scientific. It's human, because what you've been carrying is not just a personality type. It's a life experience, a life of being too perceptive for shallow places, too intense for casual rooms, too honest for people who confuse connection with consumption. And that's why your path looks different. Jung would say that individuation isn't the process of becoming acceptable. It's the process of becoming whole. It's where you stop living as a persona built to survive the collective and start living as a self built to tell the truth. That's what your silence has been guiding you toward. Not isolation, individuation. Because when you are alone, you are not empty. You are in dialogue with your own soul. You are listening for what is real. You are separating what belongs to you from what was projected onto you. You are slowly gathering the pieces of your life into meaning. And that makes you rare. Not superior. Not better. Just rare in the way deep oceans are rare in a world obsessed with shallow waves. So if you've spent years feeling strange for needing space, if you've wondered why people exhaust you faster than they exhaust others, if you felt guilty for not wanting to be everywhere, with everyone, all the time, let the guilt fall away. Because your quiet is not a malfunction. It's a design. It's the architecture of a mind that was built to explore depth. You don't belong to crowds that demand performance. You belong to spaces that allow truth. You don't need many people. You need the right people. And most importantly, you don't need to apologize for the way your psyche protects its light. So the next time someone mistakes your calm for distance, your boundaries for arrogance, or your solitude for dysfunction, Remember this. You are not antisocial. You are selective because you are deep, and you are deep because your soul is trying to become whole. If this felt like someone finally put words to what you've lived, stay close to this channel, because everything here is built for minds like yours. Quiet, intense, perceptive, and unwilling to live a life that isn't real. And this is where we continue.